In the unforgiving criminal underworld of Chicago, weakness is a death sentence, and a smile is a dangerously rare commodity. For Lorenzo Bianchi, the undisputed head of the city's most feared syndicate, his face had been a mask of stone for exactly 1,095 days. Not a smirk, not a grin. Nothing. Not since the night the streets ran red with the blood of the only woman he ever loved. He was a ghost, walking in a tailored Tom Ford suit, until a rainy Tuesday night at a high-stakes underground club. He heard a voice, a haunting melody, and then the impossible happened. The devil smiled. Stick around, because this isn't your typical fairy tale. It's a true-to-life story of blood, betrayal, and a song that changed the Mafia forever. To understand the gravity of a single smile, you must first understand the man who forgot how to make one. Lorenzo Bianchi was not a caricature of a mobster. He was a refined, terrifyingly quiet businessman who operated in the shadows of Chicago's Gold Coast. He controlled the ports, a significant portion of the city's real estate development, and a sprawling network of underground gambling rings. 3 years ago, Lorenzo had been a different man. He was ruthless, yes, but he possessed a vibrant, dark charisma. That was when he was engaged to Sophia Romano. Sophia wasn't in the life. She was a civilian, an architect who had somehow bypassed Lorenzo's ironclad defenses. But in this world, love is a liability. On a humid night in July, a rival faction, the formidable Navarro cartel out of Miami, decided to send a message. The car bomb was meant for Lorenzo. Instead, he had stepped back into the restaurant to grab Sophia's forgotten shawl. The blast shattered the windows of Michigan Avenue and took Sophia from him instantly. Since that night, Lorenzo hadn't just survived. He had become a machine. He systematically dismantled the Navarro operation, leaving a trail of bodies from Illinois to Florida. He secured his empire, but the cost was his humanity. For 3 years, his associates, even his loyal underboss, Matthew Rossi, had not seen his lips curve upward. His eyes, a chilling shade of pale hazel, held the warmth of a frozen lake. To work for Lorenzo Bianchi was to walk perpetually on a razor's edge. A wrong word, a nervous laugh, or a failure to deliver meant dealing with a man completely devoid of empathy. It was exactly the 3-year anniversary of Sophia's death. The atmosphere in Lorenzo's inner circle was suffocatingly tense. He had spent the morning visiting a private mausoleum in Graceland Cemetery, leaving no flowers, just standing in silence for an hour. By nightfall, he retreated to his prized front business, the Velvet Note, an exclusive, heavily guarded jazz and supper club tucked beneath an unremarkable office building in River North. The Velvet Note was where the city's elite mingled with its most dangerous. Politicians clinked crystal glasses of Macallan 25 with men who carried unregistered firearms in their bespoke suits. Lorenzo sat in his usual elevated VIP booth, shrouded in dim amber lighting, nursing a glass of scotch. He was flanked by Matthew and 2 silent, heavily built enforcers. Down on the floor, the staff operated with military precision. Dropping a tray tonight wouldn't just result in a reprimand. It could mean vanishing entirely. The club manager, a high-strung man named Philip Hastings, was sweating profusely. He knew what day it was. He knew the boss was in a dark, volatile mood. And to make matters worse, Philip was currently staring at a text message that was about to ruin everything. The headline act, a renowned jazz vocalist imported from New York for the week, had just been involved in a multi-car pileup on the Kennedy Expressway. She wasn't dead, but she certainly wasn't singing tonight. "What do you mean she's in the ER?" Philip hissed into his phone, hiding in the kitchen corridor. "I have Lorenzo Bianchi sitting in booth 1. If the stage stays empty for more than 10 minutes, he'll have my head on a silver platter." As Philip spiraled into a panic attack, a waitress squeezed past him, carrying a stack of empty silver cloches. Her name was Sienna Holloway. Sienna Holloway was 24, chronically exhausted and drowning in debt. She had moved to Chicago from New Orleans 8 months ago, fleeing a messy past and trying to pay for her younger brother's staggering medical bills at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. She worked double shifts at the Velvet Note, keeping her head down, navigating the dangerous clientele with a practiced, invisible grace. She was strikingly beautiful, but she actively downplayed it. Her dark hair was always pulled back into a severe bun, and her standard-issue black dress and white apron hid her figure. She knew exactly what kind of men frequented this club, and she had no desire to catch their eye. "Philip, move," Sienna said gently, trying to get past the hyperventilating manager. "Table 4 needs their check." "We're dead," Philip muttered, dragging his hands down his face. "The band is playing instrumental filler. The boss is staring at the stage. He hates instrumental filler. He's going to ask where the singer is." Sienna paused. She looked through the porthole window of the kitchen door. The lighting was low, the air thick with expensive cigar smoke. She could see the silhouette of Lorenzo Bianchi in the VIP booth. Even from this distance, the oppressive aura radiating from him was palpable. She knew the whispers about him. Everyone did. The man of ice, the grieving widower who drowned his sorrow in blood. "Put someone else up there," Sienna suggested, adjusting her tray. "Who?" Philip snapped, his voice cracking. "You want me to ask the bartender to sing Sinatra? It has to be a professional. It has to be perfect." Sienna bit the inside of her cheek. Back in New Orleans, before the medical bills, before the eviction notices, she hadn't just been a waitress. She had been the lead vocalist at a brassy, hole-in-the-wall jazz joint on Frenchman Street. She had a voice that could make grown men weep, a gritty, soulful alto that carried the weight of 100 lifetimes. She had stopped singing when she moved. The joy of it had been eclipsed by the raw need to survive. But she needed this job. If Philip got fired, or worse, if the club was shut down because Lorenzo Bianchi threw a grief-fueled tantrum, she wouldn't be able to pay for her brother's dialysis next week. "I'll do it," Sienna said quietly. Philip stared at her, as if she had just sprouted a second head. "You?" "Sienna, you carry plates." "I sing," she corrected, untying the knot of her white apron and tossing it onto a prep counter. "I need my job, Philip. You need a distraction. Let me go out there." "If you go out there and sound like a dying cat, he won't just fire us, Sienna. He'll—" "I won't," she interrupted, her voice hardening with a sudden, surprising authority. She reached up, pulled the pins from her hair, and let the dark, heavy waves cascade down her shoulders. She smoothed out the black dress. "Tell the band to give me an E-flat minor, and tell them to follow my lead." Before Philip could protest further, Sienna pushed through the swinging doors and walked out onto the floor. The ambient noise of the club was a low, steady hum of clinking glass and hushed, dangerous conversations. The jazz trio on stage was awkwardly looping a basic progression, looking terrified. Sienna walked up the side stairs, stepping into the spotlight. In the VIP booth, Matthew noticed her first. He leaned over to Lorenzo. "Boss, looks like the new act is stepping up. Odd, she looks like one of the wait staff." Lorenzo didn't immediately look up. He was staring at the amber liquid in his glass, trapped in the memory of a car exploding 3 years ago. The silence, the music, It all felt like white noise against the screaming in his head. On stage, Sienna approached the vintage microphone stand. She wrapped her hands around the cold metal. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked directly up at the dimly lit VIP booth. She took a slow, deep breath, nodded to the pianist, and began. She didn't choose a standard, upbeat lounge song. She chose I Put a Spell on You, but stripped it down to a haunting, agonizingly slow tempo. The moment the first note left her lips, the entire club seemed to freeze. It wasn't just that she had a good voice. It was the raw, unadulterated pain pouring out of her. It was a voice drenched in whiskey and heartbreak. The sultry, raspy tone cut through the smoke-filled air like a physical blade. The wealthy patrons stopped their conversations. The waitstaff paused with trays in hand. Up in the booth, Lorenzo's hand froze around his glass. The sound hit him in the chest with the force of a physical blow. Slowly, agonizingly, he lifted his head. His cold, hazel eyes locked onto the stage. He saw a girl in a simple black dress, her eyes closed, pouring her soul into the microphone. There was no theatrical performance, no cheap cabaret dancing, just pure distilled emotion. The way her voice cracked on the higher notes, the way she dragged out the phrasing. It resonated with the darkest, most broken parts of Lorenzo's soul. It was as if she was singing the exact frequency of his grief. As she hit the final, lingering note, letting it echo through the absolute dead silence of the room, she opened her eyes. They met Lorenzo's across the distance. For 3 years, Lorenzo Bianchi had felt nothing but a cold, heavy void. But in that split second, a crack formed in the ice, a feeling he couldn't quite identify. Admiration, shock, or perhaps the faintest spark of life bubbled up. Matthew, sitting next to him, stopped breathing. He watched in stunned, terrified disbelief as Lorenzo's rigid jaw relaxed. The corners of Lorenzo's mouth twitched, and then, bathed in the dim amber light of the club, Lorenzo Bianchi smiled. It was a small, quiet, genuine smile. The entire club, which had been holding its collective breath, noticed. The shift in the room's atmospheric pressure was instantaneous. The devil had smiled. The applause that followed was deafening, fueled entirely by the relief of the patrons who saw the boss's reaction. Sienna gave a small, polite bow, her heart hammering against her ribs. She felt lightheaded, the adrenaline crashing through her veins. She stepped off the stage, intending to head straight to the kitchen to retrieve her apron and hide. Before her foot hit the bottom step, a massive figure materialized in her path. It was one of Lorenzo's enforcers, a wall of a man in a dark suit. "Mr. Bianchi would like a word," the man rumbled, gesturing toward the VIP staircase. It wasn't a request. Sienna swallowed hard. Her hands were shaking slightly, but she forced her spine stiff. "Lead the way." As she ascended the carpeted stairs to the elevated booth, the noise of the club faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. The VIP area was a fortress of plush velvet leather and polished mahogany. Matthew stood up as she approached, his eyes darting nervously between her and his boss. Lorenzo remained seated. He didn't say a word for a long, agonizing minute. He just studied her. Up close, Sienna realized just how terrifyingly handsome he was. The sharp angles of his face, the impeccably styled dark hair, and those pale, calculating eyes that seemed to dissect her down to her very marrow. "What is your name?" Lorenzo finally asked. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated in the air between them. "Sienna," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "Sienna Holloway." You pour drinks for my patron, Sienna Holloway, he noted, gesturing lazily to the floor below. Yet you sing like you've lived a dozen tragic lives. Why are you hiding in a waitress uniform? I'm not hiding, Mr. Bianchi, Sienna said, lifting her chin. I'm working. The scheduled singer didn't show. Philip needed someone to fill the dead air. I volunteered. Lorenzo leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his eyes never leaving hers. The smile was gone, replaced by a sharp, intense curiosity. That wasn't dead air you were filling. You commanded the room. You commanded me. Matthew shifted uncomfortably. Lorenzo had never spoken to anyone like this. Not in 3 years. It was just a song, Sienna murmured, though she knew that was a lie. Nothing is just anything in my world, Lorenzo countered softly. You have a gift. I want you on that stage every night. You're done serving tables. From tomorrow, you are the exclusive resident vocalist of the Velvet Note. You will be paid 5 times what you make now, plus tips. Sienna's breath hitched. 5 times her salary. It was enough to cover the dialysis. It was enough to move her brother to a better facility. It was a lifeline thrown by the devil himself. I accept, she said, nodding slowly. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Lorenzo said, leaning back into the shadows of the booth. You belong to this club now. That means you belong to me. Understand? Sienna nodded again, excusing herself and walking back down the stairs. Lorenzo watched her retreat, a strange, unfamiliar warmth flickering in his chest. For the first time in over 1,000 days, he wasn't thinking about Sophia. He was thinking about the girl with the sad eyes and the whiskey voice. But as Sienna pushed back through the kitchen doors, out of sight of the VIP booth, her terrified demeanor instantly vanished. Her posture straightened, and the vulnerability in her eyes evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating steel. She walked into the employee locker room, ensuring she was alone. She pulled a burner phone from the bottom of her bag and dialed a number with a Miami area code. The line clicked open. It's done, Sienna whispered into the receiver. I'm in. Did he suspect anything? A raspy voice on the other end replied. No, Sienna said, a dark, victorious smirk playing on her lips. He didn't just buy it. He smiled. The monster actually smiled. Good work, Isabella, the voice replied, using her real name. 3 years ago, he took out the Navarro cartel and thought he killed Sophia's true allegiance. He thinks he won. Gain his trust. Make him fall for you. And when he's completely vulnerable, we tear his empire down from the inside. Sienna hung up the phone, looking at her reflection in the locker room mirror. Lorenzo Bianchi thought an angel had just saved his night. He had no idea he had just invited the architect of his destruction directly into his inner sanctum. The real game had just begun. Over the next month, the Velvet Note transformed from a prestigious underground club into a shrine, and Sienna Holloway was its reluctant deity. The transition was dizzying. Lorenzo Bianchi didn't just give her a residency. He curated her entire existence. Her cramped, mold-scented apartment in Pilsen was replaced by a sprawling, light-filled loft in the Gold Coast, paid for in full under a dummy corporation. Her wardrobe of thrift store dresses was discarded, replaced by racks of custom-tailored silk gowns, vintage Chanel, and genuine Cartier jewelry delivered by silent men in dark suits. Lorenzo's justification was simple. The voice of my club cannot look like a charity case. To the outside world, she was the ultimate Cinderella story. To the criminal underworld, she was the boss's untouchable new obsession. but to the Navarro cartel operating in the humid shadows of Miami, she was Isabella, the perfect weapon, finally slipped past the dragon's teeth. Every night she sang. She poured fabricated heartbreak into the microphone, her sultry alto wrapping around the room like smoke. And every night Lorenzo sat in booth 1, watching her with those pale, calculating hazel eyes. He was a man thawing from a 3-year winter, and Isabella was the fire. But the closer she got to the flames, the more she realized that the monster she had been trained to destroy didn't match the man sitting in the booth. "You missed the drop," the raspy voice of Don Alejandro crackled through her encrypted burner phone one rainy Tuesday afternoon. Isabella was pacing the hardwood floors of her luxury loft, staring out at the grey, churning waters of Lake Michigan. "I couldn't get to the secondary servers," Isabella whispered, keeping her voice low despite being alone. "Lorenzo's underboss Matthew is always watching. He doesn't trust me. He ran a background check on Sienna Holloway yesterday." "And?" Alejandro demanded, the threat evident in his tone. "And it held up," Isabella replied smoothly. "The forged medical records for my non-existent brother, the fake New Orleans history. It's solid. But Matthew has instincts. If I push too hard for the shipping manifests at the port, he'll flag me. I need more time to get Lorenzo entirely isolated." "You don't have time, Isabella," Alejandro snarled. "The Bianchi Syndicate is moving 3 tons of product through the Navy Pier shipments next week. We need the exact coordinates and container numbers. You make him fall for you, and you extract that data. Remember what he did to Sophia. Remember who you are fighting for, Sophia." The name was a phantom limb. Isabella had been trained by Sophia's surviving loyalists. She had been fed the story of the innocent architect, slaughtered by Lorenzo's enemies, a tragedy Lorenzo used to consolidate his own tyrannical power. "I'll get it," Isabella promised, hanging up the phone and hiding it beneath the false bottom of her jewelry box. That evening, the routine shattered. When Isabella finished her set, the massive enforcer, Dante, didn't point her toward her luxurious new dressing room. He pointed her toward the private elevator. "Mr. Bianchi wants you to join him for dinner," Dante grunted. Isabella's stomach tightened. This was the opening she needed, but her pulse hammered with genuine, unscripted anxiety. The private elevator opened not to a restaurant, but to the roof of the building, where a sleek, black helicopter was waiting, its rotors slicing through the damp Chicago air. Lorenzo stood by the open door, wearing a charcoal Tom Ford suit, the wind whipping his dark hair. He offered his hand. "Where are we going?" Isabella asked, shouting over the engine roar as she took his hand. His grip was warm, firm, and calloused from years of handling firearms. "I decided the club's menu was becoming monotonous," Lorenzo said, pulling her inside. "I made a reservation at a Linnea." Isabella blinked in shock. A Linnea was a 3 Michelin-star fortress of culinary perfection in Lincoln Park. You didn't just make a reservation on a whim, unless you were Lorenzo Bianchi. The dinner was a masterclass in psychological warfare. They sat in a private dining room, surrounded by avant-garde dishes that looked more like modern art than food. Lorenzo poured her a glass of Barolo that cost more than her fake brother's medical bills. "You've been tense, Sienna," Lorenzo observed, cutting into a delicate piece of Wagyu beef. "Your voice was tight tonight during Cry Me a River. What's bothering you?" Isabella forced a small, self-deprecating smile. "Just overwhelmed, Mr. Bianchi. 3 weeks ago, I was dodging eviction notices. Now I'm flying in helicopters and wearing diamonds that cost more than a house. It's a heavy crown." "Drop the Mr. Bianchi," he said softly, leaning back. "It's Lorenzo." Lorenzo. She tested the name on her tongue. It felt dangerous. People look at this life and see only the gold, Lorenzo murmured, swirling his wine. His hazel eyes locked onto hers, stripping away her defenses. They don't see the cage. When you have power, true power, you stop living in the world. The world starts living around you. You can't trust a smile because it's usually bought. You can't trust a tear because it's usually a manipulation. Isabella felt a cold sweat prickle at the base of her neck. Did he know? But your voice, Lorenzo continued, his gaze softening marginally. Your voice is the only honest thing I've heard in 3 years. When you sing, you aren't asking me for anything. You're just bleeding. And I respect a beautiful bleed. Isabella swallowed hard. She was supposed to manipulate him, to find the cracks in his armor. But sitting across from him, she didn't see the butcher of the Chicago underworld. She saw a profoundly isolated man carrying a grief so immense it was crushing him. You lost someone, Isabella guessed softly, playing the empathetic civilian. That's why you didn't smile for so long. Lorenzo's jaw tightened. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I lost my fiancée, Sophia, 3 years ago. A bomb meant for me. I'm sorry, she whispered, and to her absolute horror, she realized the sympathy in her chest was genuine. Don't be, Lorenzo said, his voice turning to steel. The men who did it are dead. Their families are dead. The earth where their homes stood is salted. He looked at her, and the ruthless mob boss was back. That is the reality of my world, Sienna. It is cold, and it is absolute. Are you sure you want to be a part of it? Isabella looked directly into the eyes of her target. I don't think I have a choice anymore, Lorenzo. The opportunity to steal the shipping coordinates presented itself at the worst possible moment. The Continental Gala. Held in the opulent grand ballroom of the Palmer House Hilton, the gala was supposedly a charity fundraiser for Chicago's underprivileged youth. In reality, it was a summit. The heads of the 5 families of the Midwest were gathering to discuss territories, settle blood feuds, and launder millions of dollars through silent auctions. Lorenzo had insisted Isabella accompany him, not as entertainment, but as his date. She wore a breathtaking, backless emerald gown that clung to her curves like a second skin. Her dark hair was swept up in an elegant chignon, exposing the delicate line of her neck. When she stepped out of her bedroom in the loft, Lorenzo, waiting by the door, actually stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. You look, Lorenzo started, his voice uncharacteristically thick. He cleared his throat. You look dangerous, Sienna. I'll take that as a compliment, she murmured, accepting his offered arm. The ballroom was a sea of velvet, diamonds, and hidden malice. Isabella played her part perfectly. She smiled at the right mobsters, laughed at the terrible jokes of corrupt city aldermen, and kept a mental map of Lorenzo's security detail. Matthew was never more than 10 feet away, glaring daggers at her back. He hates me, Isabella whispered to Lorenzo as they waltzed across the marble dance floor to a live string quartet. Matthew is paid to hate everyone, Lorenzo replied smoothly, his hand resting warmly on the bare skin of her lower back. The touch sent involuntary shivers down her spine, a biological betrayal she fiercely tried to suppress. He thinks you're a distraction, and in my line of work, a distraction is a vulnerability. Am I? She asked, looking up into his eyes. A distraction? Lorenzo pulled her fractionally closer. You are a complication, Sienna. But for the first time in years, I don't mind things being complicated. As the waltz ended, Lorenzo was pulled aside by the head of the Detroit syndicate for a private conversation in the adjoining VIP parlor. Isabella was left near the ice sculptures, sipping a flute of champagne. This was it. She knew Lorenzo's encrypted smartphone, the one containing the master ledgers and the shipping coordinates, was in the breast pocket of his discarded suit jacket, draped over a chair near the VIP parlor entrance. Matthew was distracted, arguing with a bouncer near the main doors. Isabella slipped through the crowd like a ghost. She reached the chair. Her heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She slid her hand beneath the silk lining of the jacket. Her fingers brushed the cold metal of the phone. She just needed 2 minutes to plug in the USB skimmer Alejandro had given her. Suddenly, the hair on the back of her arms stood up. It was an instinct drilled into her during her brutal training in Miami. A shift in the room's energy, the sudden absence of sound from a specific corner. Isabella turned her head. Up on the mezzanine level, cloaked in the shadows of the heavy velvet drapery, the moonlight caught the reflection of a matte black rifle barrel. It was pointed directly at the VIP parlor entrance, pointed exactly where Lorenzo was about to step out. In a fraction of a second, the conditioning of the cartel warred with a terrifying alien emotion blossoming in her chest. If Lorenzo died right now, her mission was over. The cartel won. Sophia was avenged. She could disappear back into the night, but as Lorenzo stepped out of the parlor, laughing at something the Detroit boss had said, Isabella didn't see a target. She saw the man who had ordered her favorite flowers for her dressing room. She saw the man who had looked at her with such profound, broken reverence at her Linnea. She didn't think. She moved. "Lorenzo, get down!" Isabella screamed, her voice tearing through the genteel hum of the ballroom. She lunged forward, hitting him with her entire body weight, just as the suppressed crack of the rifle echoed through the hall. Chaos erupted. The bullet, intended for Lorenzo's skull, shattered the marble pillar inches from where he had just been standing, spraying razor-sharp stone shrapnel into the air. Lorenzo and Isabella crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs and emerald silk. Instantly, the ballroom devolved into a war zone. Women screamed. Tables were flipped, and Lorenzo's enforcers drew their weapons, returning blind fire toward the mezzanine. "Are you hit?" Lorenzo roared, ignoring the gunfire, his hands frantically checking Isabella's body. His eyes were wide, panicked, a stark contrast to the icy Mafia boss he portrayed. I'm fine," Isabella gasped, though a sharp, burning pain was beginning to radiate from her upper arm, where a piece of stone shrapnel had sliced through the skin. Matthew materialized above them, firing 2 shots into the ceiling. "Boss, we have to move, now!" Lorenzo hauled Isabella to her feet, throwing his body over hers as a human shield. They sprinted through the kitchen corridors, the sounds of shouting and gunfire fading as they breached the underground parking garage. Dante had the armored SUV running. Lorenzo shoved Isabella into the back seat and dove in after her. "Drive," he barked. The SUV peeled out into the rainy Chicago night, tires screaming against the wet asphalt. Inside the car, the silence was deafening, broken only by Isabella's ragged breathing. Lorenzo turned to her. He saw the blood staining the emerald silk of her dress. His face darkened into an expression of absolute, terrifying fury. He ripped his silk tie from his neck and quickly tied it around her bicep as a makeshift tourniquet. "You saved my life," Lorenzo stated, his voice a low, vibrating growl of disbelief. "You saw the shooter, and you stepped into the line of fire for me." "Why?" Isabella looked at him, her carefully constructed lies completely unraveling in the face of adrenaline and blood loss. She had ruined the mission. She had betrayed her cartel. and she had no idea how to answer him, because the truth was a death sentence for them both. "I don't know," she whispered, a single tear escaping her eye. "I just couldn't let you die." Lorenzo stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. Then, with a sudden, desperate ferocity, he reached out, grabbed the nape of her neck, and pulled her lips to his. The kiss was not romantic. It was a violent collision of survival, adrenaline, and repressed desire. It tasted like expensive champagne, copper blood, and pure desperation. Lorenzo kissed her as if he was trying to breathe her soul into his own lungs, his hands gripping her waist with bruising force. Isabella kissed him back with equal ferocity, surrendering entirely to the madness. Every warning bell in her head was screaming, but the roaring in her ears drowned them out. The SUV screeched to a halt in the secure underground bunker beneath Lorenzo's private penthouse on Lakeshore Drive. The estate was a fortress, heavily guarded by heavily armed men who looked on edge. Lorenzo didn't let anyone else touch her. He carried her out of the vehicle and into the private elevator, his jaw set in a rigid line. Inside the penthouse, the city of Chicago sprawled out beneath them, a glittering grid of lights against the black water of the lake. Lorenzo bypassed the lavish living room and carried her straight into his massive master bathroom, setting her gently on the edge of the marble vanity. He didn't call his private doctor. He retrieved a sleek black medical kit from the wall. "This is going to sting," he muttered, his voice hoarse. Isabella sat silently as he carefully cut away the bloody fabric of her sleeve. He cleaned the deep graze on her arm with antiseptic, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man who ordered executions before breakfast. "Who were they?" Isabella asked, wincing slightly as he applied a butterfly bandage. "Russian bratva out of the south side," Lorenzo replied, his eyes dark. "They've been getting bold. Someone is funding them, giving them intel. Someone with deep pockets." Isabella's stomach plummeted. The Navarro cartel. Alejandro had hired the Russians to do the dirty work, while Isabella played the inside game. She was effectively sleeping with the enemy of her own employer. "You should have let Matthew handle it," Lorenzo said softly, looking up from her arm, his eyes locking onto hers. "You are a civilian, Sienna. You don't take bullets for me. Never again. Do you understand?" "I couldn't just watch," she whispered. Lorenzo reached up, tracing the line of her jaw with a blood-stained thumb. "I spent 3 years wishing I had died in that blast with Sophia. I prayed for a bullet. And tonight, when I saw that laser, I didn't care about my life. I cared that you were standing too close to me." He leaned in, capturing her lips again. This time the kiss was slower, agonizingly tender, and devastatingly deep. It was a surrender. Isabella wrapped her uninjured arm around his neck, pulling him flush against her. They stumbled out of the bathroom, leaving a trail of discarded clothing across the thick Persian rugs, falling into the massive, silk-sheeted bed. For hours the war outside didn't exist. There were no cartels, no syndicates, no lies. There was only the heat of their skin, the desperate, whispered confessions in the dark, and a profound, terrifying vulnerability that bound them together. It was 4 a.m. when Isabella woke up. The penthouse was dead silent, save for the rhythmic drumming of rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Lorenzo was asleep beside her, one heavy arm draped protectively across her waist. In the pale moonlight, his face looked younger, the harsh lines of tension finally smoothed away. Reality crashed back into Isabella like a freight train. She had compromised everything, but she was still trapped. If she didn't deliver the shipping coordinates to Alejandro by morning, The cartel would kill her fake brother, who was actually a kidnapped civilian being held hostage to ensure her compliance. She had to finish the job, even if it destroyed her. Carefully, agonizingly, she slid out from under Lorenzo's arm. She pulled on one of his discarded dress shirts, the silk cold against her bare skin, and crept out of the bedroom. She knew where he kept the master server. Matthew had let it slip weeks ago. It was in Lorenzo's private study, a room locked behind a biometric scanner. Isabella approached the heavy oak door of the study. She had prepared for this. She reached into her hidden garter belt, which she had discarded in the hallway, and retrieved a piece of transparent tape. Earlier in the evening, she had pressed Lorenzo's thumb onto her champagne flute. She had carefully lifted the print. She pressed the tape to the scanner. A green light flashed. The door clicked open. The study was dark, smelling of leather and aged scotch. She moved directly to the massive mahogany desk. She booted up the terminal, plugged in the USB skimmer, and typed in the bypass code Alejandro had provided. A progress bar appeared on the screen, quietly copying the syndicate's entire logistical network. While she waited, her eyes drifted to the corner of the room. Behind a false bookshelf, slightly ajar, was an old-fashioned, heavy steel safe. It wasn't electronic. It was mechanical. Curiosity, fueled by the adrenaline still coursing through her veins, drew her toward it. The door to the safe was unlocked, as if Lorenzo had been looking through it earlier that day and forgotten to spin the dial in his haste to leave for the gala. Isabella pulled the heavy steel door open. There was no money inside, no guns, just a single, thick, leather-bound dossier and a stack of photographs. Isabella picked up the top photograph. It was a picture of Lorenzo, looking hoarsely happy, with his arm wrapped around a stunning, blonde woman. Sophia. Isabella turned the photo over, but it wasn't the back of the photo that caught her attention. It was the official, stamped document lying beneath it. It was a bank ledger. From a private offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Isabella squinted in the dim light, reading the account holder's name. Sophia Romano. Her brow furrowed. Sophia was an architect. Why did she have millions of dollars in offshore accounts? She opened the thick leather dossier. It was an investigation report compiled by Matthew Rossi, dated 3 weeks after Sophia's death. Isabella began to read, scanning the heavily redacted lines. Suddenly, her breath caught in her throat. The room seemed to spin. Communications intercepted between subject, Sophia Romano, and the Navarro cartel leadership. Subject confirmed as a deep cover operative inserted into Bianchi's inner circle. Wire transfer confirms subject received $5 million to provide the Navarro hitmen with Bianchi's exact itinerary on the night of the bombing. Isabella dropped the file. It hit the carpet with a dull thud. No, it couldn't be. She scrambled to pick up more papers, her eyes darting frantically across the text. The bomb that killed Sophia wasn't a tragic mistake. The bomb was planted by the Navarro cartel, orchestrated by Sophia herself, to kill Lorenzo. But Lorenzo had forgotten Sophia's shawl. Sophia had stayed in the car to wait. The timer had malfunctioned. Sophia had been blown up by her own trap. Isabella pressed a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. Everything Alejandro had told her, everything her cartel had trained her to believe about Lorenzo, the monster who murdered an innocent woman, was a lie. Sophia was exactly what Isabella was right now. A rat. A honey trap sent by the Navarro cartel to tear down the Bianchi empire. Lorenzo hadn't gone on a rampage out of blind, psychopathic rage. He had gone to war because the woman he loved had sold him to his enemies. Beep. The computer monitor flashed green. The USB drive had finished downloading the coordinates. The tool meant to orchestrate Lorenzo's final downfall was ready. Isabella stared at the glowing flash drive. She was the second bullet fired by the Navarro cartel. She was supposed to finish the job Sofia had started. You aren't supposed to be in here. The voice, cold and devoid of any emotion, cut through the darkness like a guillotine. Isabella froze. She slowly turned around, standing in the doorway, fully dressed, holding a silenced 9mm pistol leveled directly at her chest, was Matthew Rossi. "I knew it," Matthew whispered, stepping into the room, his eyes burning with a vindictive, triumphant hatred. "I told him you were too good to be true. Step away from the desk, Isabella. Drop the drive, Isabella, or I swear to God I will paint this mahogany desk with your brains." Matthew's voice didn't waver. His grip on the suppressed 9mm was absolute. He had been waiting for this moment for weeks. He had watched Lorenzo soften, watched the impenetrable ice around his boss melt for a woman Matthew intuitively knew was poison. Isabella froze, her fingers hovering inches from the USB drive still protruding from the tower. Her heart hammered a frantic, desperate rhythm against her ribs. She didn't raise her hands. Instead, her eyes flicked down to the dossier scattered across the Persian rug. The damning truth about Sofia. "Matthew, you don't understand," Isabella started, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't know. They lied to me." "Shut up!" Matthew hissed, taking a slow, predatory step forward. "I cloned your burner phone 3 days ago. I've been listening to your little check-ins with Alejandro in Miami. You think you're the first rat the Navarro cartel tried to slip into our house? You're just the first one who managed to get into his bed." The words struck Isabella like physical blows. Matthew knew everything. "What is going on here?" The voice from the doorway was quiet, but it carried the concussive force of an earthquake. Both Isabella and Matthew whipped their heads toward the hall. Lorenzo stood there. He was barefoot, wearing only a pair of dark suit trousers, his chest bare and bearing the faint, silver scars of a violently lived life. His hazel eyes darted from Matthew's leveled gun to the glowing computer monitor, displaying the completed download of his syndicate's logistics to the open mechanical safe. Finally, his gaze landed on Isabella. She was still wearing his oversized silk dress shirt, shivering in the cold, ambient light of the monitors. For 3 years, Lorenzo had built a fortress around his heart, constructed from grief, paranoia, and relentless violence. Tonight, he had lowered the drawbridge. He had let her in. And in return, he was standing in the exact same nightmare that had destroyed him 3 years ago. The silence that stretched between the three of them was suffocating. Isabella watched, utterly paralyzed, as the warmth in Lorenzo's eyes, the vulnerability she had kissed only hours ago, extinguished. The ice returned, thicker and darker than before. The monster was back. "Boss," Matthew said, his eyes never leaving Isabella. "She's Navarro. She's been pulling the shipping logs. She was supposed to feed Alejandro the Navy pier coordinates tonight." Lorenzo didn't blink. He walked slowly into the room, his footsteps completely silent on the thick rug. He stopped a few feet from Isabella. "Is it true?" Lorenzo asked. His voice was completely hollow. It was the voice of a man who had already decided to order an execution. Isabella looked up at him, tears finally spilling hot and fast down her cheeks. "Yes. My real name is Isabella. They trained me. They sent me to finish what the bomb started." Lorenzo's jaw clenched so hard, a muscle ticked visibly in his cheek. He looked down at the floor, noticing the scattered papers. He recognized Matthew's handwriting on the old investigation file. He realized she had opened the safe. She had read about Sophia. "So you know," Lorenzo murmured, a bitter, self-deprecating smirk twisting his lips. "You know you aren't the first whore Alejandro sent to pretend she loved me." "I am not her!" Isabella screamed, the raw desperation in her voice echoing off the walls. She lunged forward, ignoring Matthew's gun, and grabbed the lapels of Lorenzo's imaginary jacket, her fists bunching against his bare chest. Matthew shouted a warning, stepping closer, but Lorenzo held up a hand, stopping his underboss in his tracks. "They told me you were a butcher," Isabella sobbed, looking frantically into Lorenzo's dead eyes. "They told me you killed Sophia because she tried to leave you. They have my brother, Lorenzo. He's not sick in a hospital. Alejandro is holding him in a cage in a warehouse in Hialeah. If I didn't get these coordinates, they were going to put a bullet in his head." Lorenzo stared down at her, his expression unreadable. "And now you have the coordinates. You have the bullet to kill my empire. So take the drive, Isabella. Walk out. Save your brother." "No," she wept, shaking her head violently. She let go of him, reached over to the computer tower, yanked the USB drive out, and threw it onto the floor. With a sharp stomp of her bare heel, she crushed the plastic casing, shattering the drive into pieces. Matthew flinched, his gun wavering. "I saved your life at the gala because I couldn't let you die," Isabella said, her voice dropping to a fierce, broken whisper. "I fell in love with you. I read the file, Lorenzo. I know what Sophia did. I know you've been living with the guilt of surviving a woman who tried to murder you. I am not her. I am a hostage of the same cartel that ruined your life." Lorenzo looked at the crushed pieces of the USB drive. He looked at the tears streaming down her face. In his world, words meant nothing. Blood meant everything. She had just destroyed her only leverage to save her brother's life. "Matthew," Lorenzo said softly, without looking away from Isabella. "Put the gun down." "Boss, you can't be serious." "I said put the gun down," Lorenzo roared, a sudden, terrifying explosion of volume that shook the heavy oak furniture. Matthew lowered the weapon, his face a mask of furious disbelief. Lorenzo reached out, his large hands cupping Isabella's tear-stained face. His thumbs brushed away the moisture. "If you are lying to me," he whispered, his forehead resting against hers, "I won't just kill you. I will make you beg for the devil to take you. Do you understand?" "I'm not lying," she breathed, closing her eyes. "Then pick up your burner phone," Lorenzo commanded, stepping back, the cold tactician instantly taking control. "We are going to call Alejandro, and we are going to invite him to Chicago." The plan was forged in the dark hours before dawn. Lorenzo Bianchi did not survive the underworld by playing defense. He was a master of the counter-ambush. If Alejandro wanted a war, Lorenzo was going to deliver the apocalypse. Isabella retrieved the burner phone. Her hands shook as she dialed the Miami area code. Lorenzo stood right beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. Matthew stood by the door, still visibly rigid with distrust. The line clicked open. "Do you have it?" Alejandro's raspy voice demanded instantly. Isabella took a deep breath, channeling the cold, professional persona she had spent months perfecting. "I have it." It was difficult. The gala was attacked by a Russian crew. "I know." Alejandro chuckled darkly. "I paid them to create a distraction. It seems they failed to take Bianchi out, but as long as you got the shipping routes, it doesn't matter." What are the coordinates? Navy Pier is a decoy, Isabella lied smoothly, reading from the script Lorenzo had just written on a notepad. The actual drop is happening tomorrow night. Midnight. An abandoned steel mill on the Calumet River. South Daring. The product is coming in on barges, not freighters. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Isabella held her breath. If Alejandro suspected she had flipped, her brother was dead. South Daring, Alejandro finally mused. Smart, isolated, how heavily guarded. Light, she replied. Lorenzo is pulling his men back to the Gold Coast to reinforce his penthouses after the gala shooting. He's paranoid. He thinks the Russians are going to strike his home. The mill will only have a skeleton crew. Excellent work, Isabella, Alejandro said, the greed practically dripping from his words. I'm flying up with a strike team. We'll take the product, burn the mill, and cripple the Bianchi syndicate permanently. When the job is done, your brother walks. Just make sure he's safe, Isabella said, her voice cracking with genuine emotion that perfectly sold the lie. She hung up the phone. He bought it, Lorenzo said, turning to Matthew. Mobilize everyone. I want 50 men at the South Daring mill by sundown. Suppressed rifles, heavy body armor. We set up crossfire perimeters in the catwalks. When Alejandro steps into the loading bay, we lock the gates behind him. Nobody from Miami leaves that building alive. What about the girl's brother in Hialeah? Matthew asked gruffly, though his tone had shifted from hostile to purely tactical. Send Dante and our best extraction team on the private jet to Miami right now, Lorenzo ordered. Isabella will give them the address of the warehouse. They breach it the second Alejandro walks into our trap here. Timing has to be perfectly synchronized. The next 20 hours were a blur of meticulous, brutal preparation. Isabella watched Lorenzo transform into a battlefield commander. There was no hesitation, no remorse. He was the undisputed king of Chicago, defending his throne. At 10 p.m., a convoy of black SUVs left the Gold Coast. Isabella sat in the back of the lead vehicle next to Lorenzo. She was dressed in black tactical gear, her dark hair pulled tightly back. Lorenzo had given her a compact Sig Sauer P365 and demanded she stay in the armored command vehicle parked 2 blocks from the mill. I'm going in with you, Isabella insisted, as the convoy approached the rusted, monolithic skeleton of the abandoned steel mill. No, you aren't, Lorenzo replied sharply, checking the magazine of his customized rifle. Alejandro thinks you're back at my penthouse. If he sees you, he'll know it's a trap before he's fully in the kill zone. Lorenzo, if this goes wrong, it won't, he interrupted, leaning over and kissing her hard. It was a kiss of absolute possession. You gave me my life back last night, Isabella. Tonight, I give you yours. The SUVs parked in absolute silence. Lorenzo and his men vanished into the shadows of the industrial wasteland, blending into the rain and the darkness. Isabella was locked in the reinforced vehicle with a communications radio, left to listen to the ghosts of the city. Midnight approached. The tension over the radio frequencies was so thick it felt like physical pressure. Target approaching from the South Road. A sniper's voice crackled over the radio. 3 unlit vans. Heavy. Isabella held her breath. Let them enter the loading bay. Hold fire until my mark, Lorenzo's voice commanded, cool and detached. Inside the sprawling, cavernous interior of the steel mill, rain poured through holes in the rusted roof. Alejandro, flanked by 20 heavily armed cartel mercenaries, stepped out of the vans. They fanned out, tactical flashlights sweeping the empty concrete floors. Where is the product? Alejandro shouted, his voice echoing off the decaying walls. High above them, Hidden in the pitch-black catwalks, Lorenzo Bianchi looked down through his night vision scope. The crosshairs rested squarely on the chest of the man who had ordered the bombing 3 years ago. The man who had manipulated Sophia. The man who had tried to turn Isabella into a weapon. "Alejandro!" Lorenzo's voice boomed over a rigged PA system, echoing like the voice of a vengeful god. Alejandro froze, whipping his gun upward toward the darkness. His mercenaries formed a defensive circle, panicked. "You should have stayed in Miami," Lorenzo said. "Mark!" The world erupted in fire. The ambush was merciless. From all 4 sides of the catwalks, the Bianchi syndicate unleashed a devastating barrage of crossfire. The cartel mercenaries didn't stand a chance. They were caught in an inescapable kill box. The deafening roar of automatic weapons chewed through concrete and flesh. Within 45 seconds, half of Alejandro's men were dead on the floor. "Fall back to the vans!" Alejandro screamed, bleeding from a graze on his cheek, returning blind fire into the darkness. But the massive steel blast doors behind the vans suddenly slammed shut, triggered by explosives Lorenzo's men had rigged earlier. There was no escape. In the command vehicle 2 blocks away, Isabella listened to the chaotic gunfire echoing through the night. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying to a god she hadn't spoken to since she left New Orleans. Suddenly, her secondary encrypted radio buzzed. "Boss, this is Dante in Miami. Target structure breached. The hostiles are down. We have the package. The brother is safe and secured." A sob of pure, overwhelming relief tore from Isabella's throat. Dante had done it. The gunfire from the steel mill abruptly ceased. An eerie, ringing silence fell over the industrial yard. Isabella couldn't sit in the car anymore. She unlocked the heavy door and sprinted into the freezing rain, running toward the loading bay doors. When Isabella slipped through a side access door into the mill, the smell of cordite, rust, and copper hit her like a physical wall. The floor was littered with the bodies of the Navarro cartel. Lorenzo's men were systematically kicking weapons away from the dead and securing the perimeter. In the center of the carnage, illuminated by a single harsh halogen work light, was Lorenzo. He stood over Alejandro. The cartel boss was on his knees, clutching a shattered femur, his weapon kicked far out of reach. He looked up at Lorenzo with a mixture of hatred and terror. Isabella stepped out of the shadows, her boots splashing softly in the puddles. Alejandro saw her. His eyes widened in realization. "You!" he spat, coughing up blood. "You flipped! You stupid, naive little bitch! You think he loves you? He's using you just like he used Sophia." Lorenzo didn't react to the provocation. He slowly holstered his rifle and drew a sleek, silver 1911 pistol from his hip. "Sophia made a choice," Lorenzo said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "She chose your money over my life. Isabella made a choice too. She chose to burn your empire to the ground." Lorenzo held out the silver pistol, offering it to Isabella. "He took your life from you," Lorenzo told her softly, his hazel eyes locking onto hers. "He kidnapped your blood. He forced you to become a ghost. This is your closure. Take it." Isabella stared at the heavy gun. She had never killed a man. She was a singer, a sister. But looking at Alejandro, the man who had subjected her brother to months of terror, the man who had forced her to lie and manipulate the only man she had ever truly loved, the hesitation vanished. She stepped forward and took the gun from Lorenzo. The metal was warm from his grip. "Your brother is dead, Isabella," Alejandro snarled, a final desperate attempt to hurt her. "My men in Hialeah had orders." "Dante just called," Isabella interrupted, her voice steady, cold and echoing with the same authority as the Mafia boss standing beside her. "My brother is safe. He's coming to Chicago, and you are staying right here." Without a flinch, Isabella raised the weapon, aimed at Alejandro's chest, and pulled the trigger twice. The loud cracks echoed off the steel ceiling. Alejandro slumped backward onto the wet concrete, lifeless. The ringing in Isabella's ears slowly faded, replaced by the steady drumming of the rain on the tin roof. She lowered the gun, her hands trembling violently as the adrenaline began to crash. She felt she might collapse, strong arms wrapped around her from behind. Lorenzo pulled her back against his chest, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He just held her, grounding her in the bloody reality they had just survived together. 1 year later. The atmosphere inside the Velvet Note was electric. The club had been renovated, expanded, and was now recognized not just as a haven for the underworld elite, but as the premier jazz destination in the Midwest. The lights dimmed to a sultry amber. The crowd hushed in immediate, respectful silence. Isabella stepped onto the stage. She wasn't wearing a severe bun or a plain black dress anymore. She wore a stunning, backless crimson gown that caught the spotlight perfectly. Her brother, looking healthy and vibrant, sat at a front row table, clapping enthusiastically. Isabella didn't look at the crowd. She looked directly up at the elevated VIP booth. Sitting there, flanked by heavily armed guards, was Lorenzo Bianchi. He looked exactly as dangerous as he always had. But as Isabella wrapped her hands around the microphone and the band struck the first chord of a slow, soulful blues track, something remarkable happened. Lorenzo looked down at the woman who had invaded his life, shattered his defenses, and stood by his side through the fire. He raised his glass of scotch toward her, and for the thousands of patrons below, and for the ruthless enemies who still watched from the shadows, the Devil of Chicago smiled. And this time, everyone knew it was a smile that would never fade. Wow, what a journey of blood, betrayal, and unexpected love. Lorenzo and Isabella's story proves that even in the darkest, most dangerous corners of the underworld, the truth and a powerful voice can shatter the thickest ice. If this intense Mafia drama kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow romance and suspense lovers. Who do you think was the most ruthless character? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want more gripping, high-stakes stories just like this one, make sure to smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for the next thrilling story.